It appears we have entered a new, brutal and irreversible phase in the Iran war. Something shifted on March 7th that analysts had not seen coming at this scale, and the full picture is only now beginning to come into focus. Iran's air logistics network, the backbone of its regional influence projection, suddenly found itself under a level of strategic pressure that raises serious questions about the country's ability to sustain operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. This is not a story about a single strike or a single base. This is a story about what happens when a country's foundational military architecture is challenged in ways that cannot be quickly repaired or replaced. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what Iran's air power actually does. Most conversations about Iran's military focus on missiles, drones, and proxy networks, and those elements are real and significant. But underneath all of that sits a logistical framework that makes the entire system function. Iran's ability to move weapons, personnel, equipment, and supplies across the region depends heavily on its air logistics network. Without that network operating at full capacity, every downstream capability becomes harder to sustain, slower to deploy, and more exposed to disruption. Tehran, Isfahan, and a series of air facilities in Iran's central corridor have long served as the structural spine of this network. From these hubs, Iranian military planners have historically coordinated the movement of material into Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, feeding alliance networks that extend Iranian influence far beyond its borders. These are not simply landing strips, they are nodes in a system of strategic reach. When you apply pressure to the nodes, you do not simply inconvenience the network, you potentially reshape what that network is capable of doing. The events of March 7th appear to have applied exactly that kind of pressure, though the full extent of what was affected is still being assessed. According to initial reporting and regional monitoring sources, multiple military and dual-use aviation facilities experienced disruptions in rapid succession. The timing and coordination of these events have drawn significant analytical attention, because simultaneous pressure across multiple sites does not happen through coincidence. It reflects planning, intelligence preparation, and a clear strategic intention to constrain rather than simply react. What was reportedly affected goes beyond visible infrastructure. Runway systems, fuel storage arrangements, and support facilities at several locations were disrupted. This matters for a specific reason. An air force does not require the complete destruction of a base to become operationally limited. It requires the disruption of the things that allow aircraft to fly consistently, refuel quickly, carry ordnance reliably, and return to operations without extended delays. When those support systems are degraded, the aircraft sitting on the runway become far less useful, regardless of how advanced they are or how experienced the pilots. Dozens of commercial and military flights in affected areas were reportedly suspended in the immediate aftermath. Civilian aviation disruption at this scale, in the context of what was happening on the military side, points to a level of pressure that extended well beyond any single installation. Regional aviation monitors tracking flight movements noticed abnormal patterns in Iranian airspace that aligned with the timeline of reported developments. These are observable, trackable signals, and they paint a picture that official statements have not fully addressed. This brings us to one of the most strategically significant dimensions of Iran's air power situation, and one that rarely receives the attention it deserves in mainstream coverage. Iran operates one of the most unusual fleets in the world. Among its frontline interceptors are F-14 Tomcats, aircraft originally delivered to Iran during the era of the Shah in the 1970s, before the Islamic Republic came to power, and before all formal military relationships with Western suppliers were severed. Iran is the only country on Earth still operating the F-14. Every other nation that ever flew it, including the United States itself, has long since retired the platform. Operating aircraft of that age, with no access to original manufacturer support, no legal pathway to import genuine spare parts, and limited ability to reverse engineer critical avionics systems, is an engineering challenge of extraordinary proportions. Iranian technicians have kept a portion of this fleet airworthy through decades of improvisation, cannibalization of other aircraft, and domestic manufacturing of replacement components. It is a genuinely impressive technical achievement under extreme constraint, but it is also a fragile one. When the facilities that support maintenance operations, parts storage, specialized tooling, and trained technical personnel come under pressure, the ability to keep those aircraft airworthy does not simply pause. It begins to degrade. Every day that maintenance cannot be conducted on schedule, Every week that a technical team cannot safely access a facility represents an accumulation of deferred work that eventually grounds aircraft. The Iranian F-14 fleet was already operating on the margin of what sustained maintenance could support. Disruption to the infrastructure that keeps those aircraft in the air does not need to be catastrophic to be consequential. Beyond the legacy interceptor fleet, Iran has invested significantly in domestic aerospace programs, including the development of training aircraft, modified fighter variants, and a range of unmanned systems. These programs are centered on specific production and maintenance facilities. The geographic concentration of these capabilities means that disruptions to key sites carry disproportionate strategic weight. Dispersal takes time, resources, and infrastructure that may not be readily available across multiple locations simultaneously. Iran's air defense architecture adds another layer of complexity to this situation. The country has assembled a layered air defense system that includes Russian-supplied S-300 batteries, domestically developed Bava 373 systems, and a range of shorter-range interceptor platforms. On paper, this represents a credible multi-layer defense, capable of engaging targets at various altitudes and distances. Iranian officials have publicly projected confidence in the system's ability to protect critical infrastructure. But the events of March 7th have caused serious analysts to ask harder questions about whether that confidence is fully warranted. A layered defense system can be saturated by simultaneous pressure across multiple vectors. Electronic warfare can degrade radar coverage, reduce the effectiveness of targeting systems, and create windows of vulnerability that would not otherwise exist. If the strikes on March 7th succeeded in reaching their intended targets with the reported precision, then either the defense systems in those areas did not perform as their stated capabilities would suggest, or the operational approach used to conduct the strikes found a way around those defenses without requiring them to be neutralized first. Both possibilities are strategically significant, and the difference between them matters enormously for how Iran's leadership is now calculating its position. If the defense systems were bypassed through electronic suppression or some form of infiltration of the targeting chain, that is a survivable problem. Defense systems can be repositioned, frequencies can be changed, coverage gaps can be addressed, but if the systems were overwhelmed or simply outperformed, the implications are more serious because they point to a structural limitation that cannot be resolved by reconfiguring assets. This is where the intelligence dimension of this story becomes impossible to ignore. The reported precision of the strikes, the apparent knowledge of specific high-value locations within facilities, and the coordination across multiple sites, simultaneously, all suggest that whoever planned and executed these operations had access to detailed, current, and accurate information about what was where and when it would be vulnerable. That level of targeting fidelity does not come from publicly available information. It comes from sustained collection efforts involving satellite imagery, signals intelligence, communications intercepts, or human sources with access to sensitive operational details. Iranian security services are acutely aware of the persistent threat from intelligence penetration, and they have invested heavily in counterintelligence operations over many decades. But no system is perfect, and the pattern of what was reportedly struck suggests either that collection capabilities against Iranian military infrastructure have reached a significantly higher level of effectiveness, or that the coordination of multiple intelligence streams produced targeting data that Iran's security apparatus was not able to detect and interdict before it was used. For Iranian military planners, this is perhaps the most unsettling implication of the March 7th developments. Physical infrastructure can be rebuilt, damaged runways can be repaired, aircraft can be relocated to alternative facilities. But if the intelligence picture that guided these operations is still active, still collecting, and still providing targeting data in near real time, then the act of rebuilding and relocating simply generates new targets. The operational security challenge that creates is enormous. Now step back and look at the regional strategic picture, because this is where the downstream consequences of pressure on Iran's air logistics network become most visible. Iran's regional influence projection does not operate through direct military presence alone. It operates through a system of allied groups, supply chains, financial flows, and coordinated operations that span multiple countries simultaneously. The connective tissue of that system is logistics, and a significant portion of those logistics are air-based. In Syria, Iranian military advisory personnel and associated forces have relied on air corridors for the movement of equipment and personnel. In Iraq, the relationship between Iranian military structures and allied militia networks has included logistical support that in some cases has moved by air. In Lebanon, Hezbollah's long-term military buildup has been sustained over years, partly through air shipments of components, specialized equipment, and technical expertise. These pipelines are not unlimited, and they are not without alternatives. But air logistics provides speed, flexibility, and discretion that ground routes cannot always match. If Iran's ability to operate its air logistics network is meaningfully reduced, even temporarily, the downstream effects ripple across every one of those relationships. Forces operating in Syria may receive support more slowly. Equipment movements that were previously conducted through air corridors may need to shift to longer, more exposed ground routes that pass through more checkpoints and create more observable signatures. The timeline for resupply and reinforcement stretches. Operational responsiveness declines. This does not eliminate Iranian influence in the region. That influence is deep, durable, and built on relationships that go far beyond logistics. But it does reduce the speed and flexibility with which that influence can be projected and sustained. In a region where strategic timing often determines outcomes, slower response times and reduced logistical flexibility carry real operational costs. The international dimension of this situation is being monitored very carefully by every major power with interests in the Middle East. Russia, which has its own strategic relationships with Iran and has depended on Iranian-supplied drone components in its own ongoing operations in Ukraine, is watching how this situation develops. A reduction in Iran's ability to produce and transport those systems would have implications that extend well beyond the Middle East itself. Moscow's calculation about how to respond, whether publicly or through diplomatic channels, is a variable that the coming weeks will begin to clarify. China, which has invested heavily in its own strategic relationship with Iran, including a long-term economic partnership agreement signed in 2021, is also tracking the situation closely. Beijing's posture tends toward restraint in public statements about Middle Eastern military developments, but the assessment taking place at the strategic level is anything but passive. China's interests in regional stability, in continued access to Iranian energy resources, and in the broader contest with American strategic influence in the region, all feed into how Beijing weighs what comes next. The United States and Israel, whose strategic interests have long aligned on the question of constraining Iranian military capability, are clearly the actors most analytically connected to these developments. The precise nature of who conducted the March 7th operations, through what means, and with what direct or indirect coordination, remains a subject of ongoing assessment. What is observable is the outcome, and the outcome reflects a level of operational sophistication that narrows the list of actors capable of achieving it. Now consider what choices Iran's leadership is facing in the aftermath of all of this, because understanding those choices tells you a great deal about what comes next. Iran is not without options, but every option available carries significant constraints and risks that limit how aggressively each can be pursued. The first option is accelerating the reinforcement and expansion of air defense coverage around critical facilities. This is an obvious response, and Iranian military planners are almost certainly already moving in this direction. But air defense systems are not unlimited in quantity, and deploying them effectively requires positioning decisions that involve trade-offs between protecting one location and leaving another more exposed. There are also cost and procurement constraints that limit how quickly the coverage gap can be addressed, particularly given the international sanctions environment Iran operates within. The second option is dispersal. Rather than concentrating critical aviation and logistics infrastructure at a small number of large identifiable facilities, Iran could work to distribute those capabilities across a larger number of smaller, less obvious locations. This reduces the impact of any single strike by reducing the value of any single target, but dispersal also reduces operational efficiency, complicates maintenance support, requires more trained personnel across more locations, and takes time to implement at scale. It is a strategic direction rather than a quick fix. The third option is accelerating the shift toward drone and missile systems that do not depend on the same aviation infrastructure as manned aircraft. Iran has already been moving in this direction for years, and its unmanned systems portfolio is substantial and growing. Precision strike drones and ballistic missile capabilities offer a form of regional reach that does not require a functioning manned aviation network in the same way. But these systems also depend on manufacturing facilities, supply chains, and storage infrastructure that present their own targeting profiles. What makes this moment particularly difficult for Iranian strategic planners is that none of these options is fast, cheap, or without risk, and the pressure is not static, it is ongoing. Decisions made now about where to concentrate resources, which facilities to prioritize, and which relationships to activate will shape the options available in the months ahead. For observers watching how this situation continues to develop, there are specific signals worth tracking closely. Watch for changes in Iranian commercial aviation patterns, because disruptions and resumptions in those patterns carry information about the operational status of facilities that serve dual-use purposes. Watch for statements from Iranian military officials about readiness and capability, because the gap between what is said publicly and what observable behavior indicates often reveals the actual state of decision-making. Watch for changes in the supply patterns feeding Iranian-aligned groups in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, because those patterns are measurable and will reflect any sustained reduction in logistical throughput. Watch for diplomatic communications between Tehran and Moscow or Beijing, because shifts in those relationships may indicate how Iran is seeking to offset capabilities it can no longer sustain independently. And watch for any Iranian response activity, because the form and scale of any response will itself be a signal about what capabilities remain available and what constraints have been imposed by recent developments. The situation that began on March 7th is not finished developing. The full picture of what was affected, how severely, and what the durable strategic consequences will be is still coming into focus. What is already clear is that a significant strategic challenge has been introduced into Iran's regional posture, and the way that challenge is navigated in the coming weeks will influence the balance of power in the Middle East for a considerable time ahead. The next move is not yet made, but the options available to make it have narrowed, and that narrowing is precisely the point. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.